You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hey, history fans. If you enjoy shows like The History of the Great War, then you'll love Airwave History Plus, now available on Apple Podcasts. Airwave History Plus is your ticket to ad-free listening to The History of the Great War, plus bonus content and early episodes from dozens of the most popular history podcasts, including History That Doesn't Suck, The Explorers Podcast, The History of the Second World War, the American Revolution Podcast, The History of World War II, The Age of Napoleon, and more. To get your free 7-day trial, go to the Apple page for this show and hit subscribe or search Airwave History Plus on Apple Podcasts. Airwave History Plus, the essential audio destination for history lovers.
The corporate world is like the ocean. It's alluring, but it's also full of deadly creatures that can shred you to pieces.
It becomes kind of like a Game of Thrones political arena where everyone's trying to murder you to get your job.
My family doesn't come from corporate background, so I didn't have any sort of guidance in that.
This is not your typical work podcast.
Sometimes you need to be empathetic. And then there are times that you ask for input, but you don't really give a shit.
Listen to the Ambie Award-nominated podcast, Surfing Corporate.
Stretch opportunity? What is this, yoga class? Get out of here.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Great War Revisited, Episode 9, The Anglo-German Naval Arms Race, Part 9, Planning for War. While most of this series has focused on the political and technological changes that would occur on both sides of the North Sea in the decade before the First World War, this episode is going to step back, a little bit at least, and cover what the British and the Germans actually expected their fleets and their navies to do in a war against each other. Understanding this topic is critical to understanding the navies and the ships that were being built, because what they planned to do fed back into ship design and the desire to build certain types of ships. They needed ships to be able to perform certain functions, and those functions were dictated by the war plans for both nations and what they expected the other to do in a conflict. There were three critical pieces of planning on both sides: what the navies planned to do when a war started, sort of what their opening move would be, how both sides planned to fight the commerce war, both protecting their own and attacking the other, and finally, what both navies believed would be the result of a large fleet action, which both planned to fight and, of course, both planned to win. While both navies were an important part of the war plans of both nations, it is clear that the Royal Navy was more important to the British. Their ability to win a war was dictated by the ability of the Royal Navy to succeed in its missions. The German Imperial Navy did not have the same level of responsibility. It would be cool if they won the naval sort of conflict or the naval war, but it wasn't essential to the Germans winning a conflict. When thinking about the Royal Navy, it should be evaluated based on its four primary functions. First, to ensure that British shipping, both military and commercial, had full use of the seas around the world. Second, to bring to bear economic pressure on any nation which the empire came into conflict. Third, to provide the British Army safe passage over the seas, and then to protect its lines of communication and supply. Finally, it needed to prevent an invasion of both the home islands and the empire's possessions around the world. While the growing antagonism between Britain and Germany has been the focus of these episodes, it would not be until just 10 years before the war that the German Navy was seen as the real threat. And up until roughly 1905, the French and the Russian navies were seen as the most likely enemies for the Royal Navy. The threat from these two navies was greatly amplified by the fact that the two nations were allied, and so it was expected that their navies would work together. Better relations with France after 1904 really changed this area of planning, and honestly really simplified the situation for the British. One of the major challenges for the Royal Navy when faced with France and Russia as enemies was the sheer size of the territory that they, between them, controlled. With France's vast African colonies and Russia's continent-spanning size, the threat posed by the two nations pulled Royal Navy strength in many different directions. But this changed after 1904, when the primary threat shifted from those two empires to Germany. Germany did have some colonial holdings, but they were much smaller and therefore more easily isolated, which made it easier to defend against a primarily commerce raiding. This allowed the Royal Navy to really focus just on the North Sea, as that was the area where the vast majority of the German naval strength would be located in a war. When plans shifted to focus on Germany, one of the interesting features of the earlier iterations was the very aggressive nature of the planning. War Plan Germany, or W1, which was published in 1908, would have seen the Royal Navy use aggressive attacks on German ports, a close blockade, and even possibly amphibious operations in an attempt to pull the German fleet out of port and into an early confrontation. There were serious risks with this type of plan, but they were accepted due to the overriding belief that the best course of action was to kind of force an early fleet action. The more aggressive aspects of these plans would be removed during the years after 1910, when a more reasonable appreciation for the power of mines, torpedoes, and the German fleet would take hold in the Admiralty. Although I guess Churchill did his best to bring back the aggression at the start of the war with some of his more outlandish ideas, like the Royal Navy's sortie into the Baltic. One of the challenges with the war plans that the Royal Navy was putting together, or the Germans were as well, is that the situation was constantly changing. The fleets, the political situation, the types of ships that were being built, everything was in flux. And so the planning that they were doing had to respond to a lot of those changes. And we can't really necessarily, or I won't really necessarily go through the full evolution of every plan. There are some interesting details in there, but it's probably too detailed for an episode like this. But I will just look at this kind of evolution and response to evolution for one specific type of ship, the battle cruisers. So let's kind of dig into the battle cruisers here a little bit and kind of how their role evolved over the course of, roughly the 6 or 7 years before the start of the First World War, when they were one of the two main types of ships that were being built by the German and British navies. To complete the tasks assigned to it at this time in a possible war with Germany, the Royal Navy felt that it needed large ships, capital ships. In the case of the Royal Navy, these ships came in both the battleship and battlecruiser variety. The battlecruiser had been Fisher's pet theory from before his time as the first Sea Lord. These were ships that prioritized speed over armor, which provided them with speed that could not be matched by the slower, more heavily armored battleships of the battle fleet. However, they still wielded the same guns as the battleships, which made their speed a clear sort of armor for speed swap, but it was okay because their goal was to find and attack enemy cruisers. As Fisher would say, quote, "Their speed is their protections." Fisher was successful in kickstarting the creation of these ships, and by 1912, there were enough of them to form a full squadron, which is pretty much the same point where things got messy because of how the ships could be used. In their original conception, the battle cruisers were meant to completely overwhelm enemy light and armored cruisers. These cruisers would be found doing commerce raiding or scouting for the main German battle fleet, and the battle cruisers would be able to chase them down and destroy them. In this role, as the hunter of smaller ships, the battle cruisers were unmatched in their power, and the German cruisers stood little chance at matching their firepower. The problem started when the Germans decided to meet the new British ships with a version of their own. They would also start building battle cruisers. These would have smaller guns, but they would be roughly the same speed and also possess heavier armor, under the assumption that they would have to withstand fire from the British guns before they themselves came within range. With both sides possessing battle cruisers, their new role was to seek out and destroy the enemy's battle cruisers, with both groups of battle cruisers acting as a scouting force for their battle fleet. Now, this sort of, went against their original purpose, which was to run away from ships with guns as large as their own and to run towards ships with smaller guns. Now these ships, which were originally designed to use their speed to run away from ships that posed a threat, were now forced to engage essentially their mirror image, which turned their lack of armor from an advantage, because it gave them more speed, to a liability, because they were matched in that speed by enemy ships. Along with the challenges posed to the battlecruisers by other battlecruisers, an increase in speed was not just happening for battlecruisers. There was also a constant push for greater and greater speed from the battle line, or the large collection of battleships which were at the core of both navies' fleets. For the British, this led to the Queen Elizabeth class, that most famous and celebrated of classes of battleship in the Royal Navy. They were a fusion of the armor of a battleship and the speed of the battle cruisers. They mounted 15-inch guns, the largest guns afloat, but could still match the speed of many of the battlecruiser classes. When these ships were first designed and construction began, the plan was to build enough to have a squadron of them, and then to send the earlier battlecruisers out of the North Sea and away from the primary German fleet. The battlecruisers would return to the tasks that they were designed for, and they would be spread around the world in pairs to defend British merchant shipping. In this reorganization, which was outlined in July 1914, the battlecruisers would be placed in mixed squadrons with smaller cruisers, which would force them outside of the role that they would have during the war, which was as the vanguard of the battle line, because the smaller cruisers didn't really play a role there. This dispersal was planned for 1915, but then, of course, the war happened and the plans were scrapped. The events during the war proved that concerns about the battlecruisers facing enemy battlecruisers were very valid, and things would go very poorly for the British battlecruisers at Jutland. On the other hand, during the war, the Queen Elizabeths would perform very well, and even though they were very old ships by the time of the Second World War, after some overhauls, they were still serviceable and still did quite well in the early stages of that conflict. And so that's how the battlecruiser class kind of evolved over the course of the 8 years before the war. It was created, it was refined, and then retirement was already being discussed because it was seen as something of a dead-end design with too many challenges or too many problems that were really solved in battleships by technological means, like you would see in the Queen Elizabeth class. Thinking back to that list I mentioned earlier about the responsibilities of the Royal Navy, one of them that I mentioned, which was probably the lowest threat in terms of probability, but the highest threat in terms of severity, was invasion. In the years before the war, there were discussions about how large of a threat invasion really was. It was felt that the greatest threat came from a surprise invasion, which would be incredibly challenging for an enemy to pull off, given the necessary concentration of ships and supplies for a successful jump across the Channel or the North Sea. However, the Royal Navy did not judge that a surprise invasion was impossible. If it were to happen, then it would most likely be accompanied by an attack on the home fleet before the official start of hostilities. An important point in these discussions was the relationship between the Royal Navy and the British Army. Everybody recognized that the Navy was the first line of defense against invasion. Nobody would dispute that. The question started when the two services started discussing the likeliness of an invasion and the likely ability of the Royal Navy to defend against it. The dominant belief in the Navy was that the overall strength of the Royal Navy and the command of the seas around the world made any invasion possibility incredibly remote, because even if the enemy could manage to land troops, maintaining the lines of supply would be basically impossible. On the other hand, the Army stoked concerns for a kind of bolt from the blue kind of threat, one that would just happen, that nobody saw coming, because they wanted to use that story, use that idea as a way to secure a larger budget for the Army, something that the British Army was always trying to do and was always very difficult. On the German side, they did not ever really consider an invasion. Tirpitz would call rumors of such a plan nonsense. He would use the word nonsense. He believed that it might be possible to land forces, but it would be totally impossible to keep them supplied. And this would eventually lead him to say, quote, "This foolish invasion panic was wholly stupid and impossible to understand," end quote. Invasion would become a much larger concern after the First World War, when the growing strength of air power added another major variable into the equation and gave the invading military a better way to project power over the invasion area. But we can pretty much say, with the benefit of hindsight, that any concerns about invasion of the British Isles before the First World War were basically totally unfounded.
Was the Sphinx 10,000 years old?
Were there serial killers in ancient Greece and Rome?
What were the lives of transgender, intersex, and non-binary people like in the ancient world?
We're Jen.
And Jenny.
From Ancient History Fangirl. We tell you true stories and tall tales of the ancient world. Sometimes we do it tipsy. Sometimes we have amazing guests on our show, historians like Barry Strauss, podcasters like Liv Albert, Mike Duncan, and authors like Joanne Harris and Ben Aronovich.
We take you to the top of Hadrian's Wall to watch the Roman Empire fall at the end of the world.
We walk the catacombs beneath the temple of the feathered serpent under Teotihuacan.
We walk the sacred spirals of the Nazca Lines in search of ancient secrets.
And we explore mythology from ancient cultures around the world.
Come find us at ancienthistoryfangirl.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
400 years ago, a trio of tiny kingdoms were perched on some damp islands off the coast of Europe. Within 3 short centuries, these islands would become the centre of an empire which ruled a quarter of the globe and on which the sun never set. I'm Samuel Hume, a historian of the British Empire, and my podcast Pax Britannica follows the people and events that built that empire into a global superpower. Listen to Season 1 to hear about England's first attempts at empire building, in Ireland, in North America and in the Caribbean, the first steps of the East India Company, and the political battles between king and parliament. Listen to Season 2 to hear about the chaotic years of civil war, revolution and regicide, which rocked the 3 kingdoms and the fledgling empire. In Season 3, we see how Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell ruled the powerful Commonwealth and challenged the Dutch and the Spanish for the wealth and power of the Americas and Asia. Learn the history of the British Empire by listening to Pax Britannica everywhere you find your podcasts, or go to pod.link/pax.
While the threat of invasion represented the most drastic danger, if it happened, the more likely problem was based around commerce raiding. The British Isles were totally dependent on imports to keep the country running and the people fed. Around 2/3 of its food supplies were imported, and the same proportion of manufacturing materials were also imported. The protection of this trade was crucial to the war effort, and it resulted in many conversations before the war regarding the best way to ensure its safety. The easiest way to maintain the safety of the shipping was for it to simply not encounter other enemy ships, of course. When the First World War began, the Admiralty believed that the best way to achieve this was not to use the convoy system, which would be used, later in the war. Instead, they trusted in the spreading out of the merchant ships in the belief that this would limit the damage caused by any single commerce raider. They did not even support the introduction of specific routes for merchant ships to navigate through, under the belief that these would be discovered by the enemy and then the merchant ships would be very vulnerable. There were also security concerns around convoys. Since they took time to be concentrated at a port of debarkation, this information could possibly be transmitted to the enemy to arrange for interception of the convoy while it was en route. The Royal Navy was also resistant to the idea that smaller ships, destroyers mainly, should be taken from the main fleet and sent out as convoy escorts, a concern that would remain until the Americans entered the war. Even if all these measures were taken, and the merchant ships were spread out, and they were taking uncoordinated paths, there was a recognition that this would not solve all of the problems, and there would need to be some sort of armed ship present on the merchant sea lanes. One way that this could be achieved was not by dispatching ships from the Navy, but instead by arming merchant ships and converting some merchant ships into auxiliary cruisers. These ships would be armed with guns up to 7 inches, and in 1914 there would be 39 of them available to the Royal Navy. It was hoped that this armament would deter the smaller commerce raiders that were expected to be sent out to intercept merchant shipping. These British auxiliary cruisers were likely to meet their German counterparts while at sea as well, with the Germans putting a lot of effort and planning into their own auxiliary cruisers. The German plan was to take fast ocean liners and place guns on them and turn them loose on British merchant ships. There were several advantages to using these ocean liners. They had really good endurance because they had massive storage space for supplies, because they weren't going to have a bunch of passengers like they usually did. And just as importantly, they were some of the fastest ships afloat. The early years of the 1900s were kind of the golden age for these large ocean liners that were designed and built for passenger service between Europe and other areas around the world, and the Germans had some of the best and fastest. The agreements made between the German government and the shipping companies is that they would receive various economic benefits, both in terms of just payments of money, as well as preferential government treatment. In exchange, they would install structural supports and deck fittings that would allow for quick addition of naval guns to their ships in time of war, and then of course they would give their ships to the government during that conflict. The British did have some intelligence that pointed towards these German plans, but it was a bit unclear as to their extent and what the exact plans were. As late as 1913, there were many questions that British intelligence had not yet answered, best summarized in a memo sent to Churchill during his time as First Lord of the Admiralty before the war. Quote, "The whole of this threat is very shadowy. Whether the German vessels have their guns on board is extremely doubtful. Not a scrap of evidence has been forthcoming during the last year and a half in spite of every effort to procure it. How are they to be converted on the high seas? Where are they to get rid of their passengers? Are they to take hundreds of non-combatants with them on what the stronger naval power may treat as pirate activity? Where are they to coal?" All of these questions kind of remained unanswered. But if those German ships were out there, the British had to have a response. And while one aspect of this was their own auxiliary cruisers, it was difficult to count on converted civilian vessels. So cruisers were kind of the classical answer to this problem, but there were not enough of them to go around, and those that were present were often needed in home waters. The battle cruisers were designed to protect commerce and to wipe an enemy off the seas, but they seemed overly large and powerful for the job at hand. One of the challenges with commerce raiding at this point in history was the fact that ships were running off of coal. Coal is very difficult to load onto the ships, and nobody had even come close to solving like an underway replenishment of a coal ship. Ships had to stop somewhere, meet up with a collier, and transfer coal. It was a long, laborious, difficult, hot, messy process. And that's one of the reasons that command of the sea was so important to the British before the war and then during the war. Because if the Royal Navy had control of the seas, they could control access to coal. And the limited range of any coal-fired ships around the world greatly reduced the freedom of movement of whoever did not control the coal ports. There were some concerns that maybe the Germans would send larger military ships on commerce raiding excursions, but this would not have been possible for the German fleet. What the British would learn after the war, after the German fleet was taken to Scapa Flow, was that the German ships that were part of the battle fleet were not really built for long ocean voyages. They had usually smaller coal capacities than the British ships, which allowed for other design considerations, which made them better in some situations. And they didn't have things like proper cooling or proper berthing sort of arrangements for the crew. These were all aspects that were maintained in British ships, given their more worldwide possible theater of operations. And so the threat of a possible sort of German capital ship commerce raiding party was probably overblown. It was probably never going to happen, even if the British had to at least consider it as a possibility. I will also note here that one of the interesting things about discussions about commerce raiding before the First World War, especially when we look back on it now with the benefit of hindsight and how the First World War is going to kind of develop at sea, is that the threats posed by submarines to merchant shipping only occupied a small piece of the discussions that were occurring in London and honestly in Germany as well. It was generally believed by the British before the war that the Germans would not use submarines to sink merchant shipping, at least in any large number, because when submarines wanted to sink ships, it was sort of recognized early on that if the submarines had to surface to warn the ships of the attack, then they would be vulnerable to countermeasures. There does not seem to have been much concern about the possibility of unrestricted submarine warfare, and instead it was believed that the Germans would kind of obey, I guess, the laws, very quote-unquote laws, of naval warfare and warn merchant ships before attacking them with submarines. And that meant that they would have limited utility as a commerce raiding vessel. And instead it was believed that the German submarines would almost exclusively focus on attacking British warships, either at Scapa Flow or when they were in the North Sea, or actually during a fleet action, which would actually prove to be very difficult to actually coordinate. This fear that submarines would be an important part of fleet encounters in future wars is interesting because it's one of those things that was mostly unfounded, but countermeasures against submarines were still sought after, just in case, or just because they seemed like a new threat. Due to the severe restrictions on submerged speed for early submarines, the assumption was that the best way to counter them was to push out a destroyer screen as far as possible in front of the fleet, and thereby to catch submarines on the surface as they tried to position themselves. This is part of why the British prioritized gun size on their destroyers before the war instead of torpedo armament. They believed that the goal of the British destroyers was to find and engage the enemy submarines and destroyers, and to prevent them from interfering with the activities of the fleet, instead of engaging larger ships themselves with torpedoes like the Germans were trying to do, because the British had the larger ships. They could take care of themselves against enemy surface vessels, but the destroyers had to deal with kind of eliminating the torpedo threat as much as possible. The concern about submarines is interesting, if only because the Germans were quite late to put emphasis on submarine development and construction. It was not until 1905 that the first experimental German submarines were developed, long after submarines had entered service in other navies. Even as late as 1912, they were only building a handful of U-boats every year, but as would become evident during the war, the submarine in certain situations was very effective, but those situations were quite limited, at least when it came to engaging naval ships. Merchant ships were an entirely different matter, and they required entirely different countermeasures and reactions from the British. But in terms of trying to use them in a fleet action, it was found that it was just too difficult to position them correctly because they just didn't have the mobility required. But also, communications were often a problem. It became really difficult to communicate with submarines when they submerged, and it made it difficult to kind of coordinate efforts between a surface fleet and a submarine fleet. Another job of the Royal Navy, while it was trying to protect its own maritime trade, was to interdict the maritime trade of the enemy. The tried and true Royal Navy tactic for this purpose was a close blockade of enemy ports, essentially putting a fleet as close to the enemy ports as possible to prevent any merchant ships from entering or exiting. This would be the plan for the Navy put in place for any enemy before the turn of the century. And when Germany started to be the focus of more naval planning in 1902, the close blockade was still seen as the solution. And in fact, the close blockade was seen as a solution that fit the German case even better than the French one, given the limited access that Germany had to the North Sea. It would be easier to put a blockading fleet and sort of seal off the German ports in northern Germany. However, between the turn of the century and the start of the First World War, several important events occurred. In 1902 maneuvers done by the Navy, it was proven that there were serious problems in trying to maintain a close blockade, particularly due to the increasing capabilities of the torpedo. One of the critical pieces of the blockade debate had always been the presence and now proliferation of the torpedo and the submarine which carried them. Torpedoes had first started to rise in prominence in the 1870s. However, there were many problems with the technology, even up to really the Russo-Japanese War. During that conflict, the Japanese had fired over 350 torpedoes and had only hit on 17 of them, which was not exactly a great level of accuracy. However, in the decade after the Russo-Japanese War, there was a tremendous amount of technological advancements around torpedoes, which greatly increased their range, their speed, accuracy, and explosive power. This made the torpedo a real threat to military vessels, even the largest of them. And as destroyers got faster and more capable, and as submarines went from almost a novelty to a real weapon of war, the threat of torpedoes only grew. Torpedoes exercised an important influence on naval strategy around the world, and as torpedoes and their carriers, destroyers and submarines became more capable, certain tasks that could be done by larger ships with relative impunity before were suddenly quite dangerous. One of these was executing a blockade, as we mentioned earlier. A large ship sort of has to kind of be in an area near the enemy port. and it's a relatively small area, it's relatively well known to the enemy, and that puts them at a huge risk of falling victim to a torpedo attack. It allowed much smaller vessels to attack much larger ones, something that was not really possible before the advent of the torpedo. And that put larger ships in greater danger when they were stationed in relatively static positions, like during a blockade. But the torpedo was not the only problem. Another challenge when it came to the close blockade was the fact that in the Russo-Japanese War, naval mines became a serious threat, especially the offensive use of mines. We kind of see mines are often thought of in a very defensive way. You kind of lay a minefield and you kind of wait for somebody to run into it. But there are also offensive ways to use mines, quickly laying them at night in front of an enemy fleet, sort of having free-floating mines that move into an enemy's fleet area. All of these were serious problems, and these new technologies caused many losses for both Russian and Japanese ships during their war in the Far East, and it was a major point of discussion for the critics of a close blockade strategy. Concerns about these new technologies would put the concept of a close blockade into question, and it would have remained official policy for several more years within the Royal Navy, but it was one of those that kind of just continued on momentum instead of being something that people really advocated for. During this period, there were a constant series of events and developments that called into question the practicality of the close blockade, and this included failed negotiations with Denmark and Sweden to give the Royal Navy access to the Baltic, and the continued increase in size and power of the German fleet. It could not be denied that in putting the home fleet or part of it so close to the German fleet, there was a serious danger of a large blockading force being attacked by a larger, or just as large, German fleet. The problem kind of came down to the fact that while the German fleet could all be concentrated in port and ready to go at any moment, the British could never stage their entire fleet off of Germany's shores or near its ports at the same time. It couldn't be there forever. Ships would have to go back to port for resupply and refit, and there would be mechanical problems. It would eat away. There'd be some attrition. The Germans would never experience this because their ships were just sitting in port, waiting for the moment that they needed to go. And even if this more damaging event did not occur, there would almost inevitably be just random attrition that might rapidly put the home fleet at a disadvantage. The debates about a close versus a distant blockade would then be embroiled in the Fisher and Beresford feud, and then also the difficulties with Fisher's successors. Beresford, for example, did not believe that a close blockade was even possible due to the simple math of the number of smaller ships in the Navy, the distance to the German coast, and the endurance of those ships while on station. Fisher still supported the close blockade, although he was, of course, incredibly cagey about discussing the Navy's war plans with anybody outside of the Admiralty. After Churchill was brought in as First Lord and Wilson was replaced as First Sea Lord, the large review of naval plans resulted in the close blockade being officially replaced with a policy of what they called an intermediate blockade, which would stretch across the North Sea. These plans for a slightly more distant blockade did not gain immediate acceptance within the entire Navy in the years before the First World War. There would always be those who felt that a close blockade would be more effective, and most of this revolved around the idea that the Navy should always be on a more offensive footing, which according to others within the Navy, and also in hindsight, was incredibly reckless. Before 1914, those in favor of a close blockade were unable to make any credible argument that explained how the close blockade should be prosecuted given the resources available to the Navy against the resources available to the German Navy. The distance blockade would be confirmed as the plan for the Royal Navy as late as just 1 month before the war, in July 1914, with the plan being described in From the Dreadnought to Scapa Flow, the Royal Navy in the Fisher Years, 1904 to 1919 by Arthur Martyr as, quote, "The fleet was to be so disposed in wartime as to block the exits from the North Sea. There would be a southerly line across the Channel from Dover, depending principally upon the Channel fleet. A northern line would extend from the Scottish coasts and the islands to Norway, with the Grand Fleet based in Scapa Flow in the Orkneys, and a line of unarmored cruisers, the Northern Patrol, it came to be called, spread between the Shetland Islands and the coast of Norway." End quote. In implementing this distant blockade policy, the Royal Navy was settling in for a long war because there was nothing to prompt a large naval battle like a close blockade might do, or probably would do. A close blockade almost invited some sort of naval confrontation. But this distant blockade was safer, and it had a much higher chance of eventual success, even if that eventual was pushed further into the future. Almost inadvertently, they didn't know they were doing this. The Royal Navy had also stumbled into the perfect strategy to use against Germany. Tirpitz's naval programs and sort of the baseline assumption by which the German Navy had been built had always been that the British would place a close blockade, and they were counting on it because it would give them the ability to kind of whittle away at the Royal Navy through attrition. It was only after that attrition had taken place that the High Seas Fleet would be in a position to meet the Royal Navy in battle. After the Royal Navy implemented a distant blockade and did not play into German plans, did not submit themselves to German attrition voluntarily, the German Navy was pushed into a difficult position without a real plan for how to deal with the Royal Navy's numerical superiority in the North Sea, which is a major reason that you see the kind of the course of the naval war during the First World War being the situation where neither side really was forced into a decisive battle at any point in time. Jutland happens almost by accident. And instead you just see a bunch of battles where they both get close or start moving in that direction, and then kind of the Germans pull away, or the British pull away if they're in a bad situation.